Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first virtual College of Liberal Arts faculty colloquium of the spring 2022 semester. My name is Dr. Quentin Maynard. I'm going to be the moderator for today's talk, as well as the rest of the talks this semester and next year. Before I turn things over to Dr. Dobersek, I'd like to make a few comments. We are recording this session. It's also being live streamed to Facebook. So if you're on Facebook, welcome. If you have any questions for the speaker, down in the bottom of your the Zoom screen, there's a Q&A button. You can either use that or the chat. I will keep track of all of those, and at the end of Dr. Dobersek's presentation, I will read the questions and have her respond. If we have any students in the audience who wish to receive extra credit for attending today's talk, please send me a message using the chat. State your name, your professor's name, and the course for which you are trying to receive extra credit. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Urska Dobersek. Dr. Urska Dobersek is an assistant professor of psychology. She joined the USI family in 2016. She teaches sports psychology and research and career-related courses. Her research focuses on body image, mate selection, and the relation between diet and mental health. She has published over 70 peer-reviewed abstracts, publications, and book chapters. Dr. Dobersek, the screen is yours. I will turn my screen off.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Quentin, for the introduction. And I appreciate the opportunity to share our work. So before I begin, I would like to mention that I am not a licensed dietitian, and I'm not here to make any dietary recommendations. I'm here to provide a scientific evidence on a relation between meat and mental health. So there are a few reasons for why we investigated this topic. One is a personal reason. For quite some time, I have been omitting certain foods throughout my life, especially meat. And another reason is that in the past century, dietary restrictions are becoming more popular and prevalent worldwide. And in addition to increased food restrictions over the past decades, there has also been an increase in mental health disorders. So people omit different types of foods for many different reasons. They choose vegetarian and vegan lifestyle for ethical reasons, where they do not like to see animals suffer, for religious reasons, and they also think that they can improve their physical and mental health. And there are many categories of vegetarian diets, and they vary in what foods they exclude and include. So for example, lacto-vegetarian diets include dairy products, but exclude meat, fish, poultry, and eggs. Lacto-ovo-vegetarian diets include dairy products, but exclude eggs, and exclude fish, poultry, and meat. Pescatarian diets include fish, but exclude meat, poultry, and dairy, as well as eggs. And there are vegan diets that exclude any animal food containing, any foods containing animal products. And then there are also semi-vegetarians or flexitarians, where they primarily consume plant-based diets, but on occasion they eat pretty much everything: meat, dairy, egg, fish. So in other words, individuals, we have many different dietary patterns. And this is an important point to keep in mind, especially when I will be discussing the methods section of our project. So in addition to increased food restrictions, there has been a substantial increase in mental health disorders. In fact, in 2017, the World Health Organization reported that mental illness was the leading cause of disability worldwide. And they estimated that over 300 million people suffer from depression. And over 260 million people suffer from anxiety. So given that depression and anxiety are the two most prevalent disorders worldwide, in a quantitative analysis, we focused on only these two disorders. So people have been altering their dietary patterns to prevent or even to treat physical and mental diseases. But the question is that a good idea? Is that healthy? Well, the evidence on whether abstaining from meat is healthy has been contradictory. Some studies suggest that vegetarians have better mental health. They report fewer negative emotions, have lower anxiety levels, and better mood comparing to meat eaters. However, there has been an increasing evidence that over time, individuals who abstain from animal foods may suffer from nutritional deficiencies and reported poorer physical and mental health. They're more likely to suffer from major depression and anxiety, and are also more likely to engage in different forms of self-harm, such as suicide, comparing to meat eaters. So an important point to mention here is that this evidence is based on self-reported both diet and self-reported mental health. So given this contradictory research, there is a need for clarity. So therefore, the purpose of our reviews was to identify the reasons for this conflicting evidence, and also to determine a relation between meat and mental health. So over the past 2 years, my colleagues and I published a systematic review and followed up with a meta-analysis examining a relation between eating meat and mental health, with a specific focus on two of the most prevalent disorders, depression and anxiety. So for those of us who are not familiar with these terms, a systematic review is a qualitative analysis and synthesis from the existing literature. And meta-analysis uses statistical techniques to determine a quantitative relation between or among the variables of interest. So we searched 5 online databases, and that included PubMed, PsycInfo, Medline, CNIL, Cochrane Library. And we used a broad set of keywords to search for the primary studies that examine psychological health in meat eaters and meat abstainers. So we included studies if they focused on only well-defined psychological constructs such as depression, anxiety, self-harm, stress, well-being, if they were written in the English language, and if there was a clear distinction between meat eaters and individuals who avoided meat. And for the meta-analysis, we included studies if they provided statistical information, such as means and standard deviations, and for us to be able to determine that a strength of that relation or a quantitative relation. And if the studies were missing any necessary information, we either contacted the authors or used supplementary data if they were available with a publication. We excluded the non-English language studies and studies that examine meat consumption on some kind of continuous level. So for example, if the researchers ask participants, to what extent do you eat meat? Or how frequently or how often do you consume meat? Or some other multi-level variable. And we also excluded studies from which we were unable to acquire statistical or other information. So following the PRISMA guidelines, we found over 7,000 relevant articles. And we excluded from those duplicates And then after omitting the studies with irrelevant titles and abstracts, we ended a little bit with over 100 articles. And then from this, we further omitted papers based on our inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then 20 of them met those conditions. So afterwards, we extracted the relevant information from these 20 studies, and that included design, participant characteristics such as number of individuals, their age, information on psychological outcomes, and information on dietary assessment, and of course, the main findings. So one important aspect of both of our reviews was study quality or methodological risk assessment. And we used a 100-point scale that was developed for the purpose of our studies. And we evaluated all 20 studies on aspects such as design, sampling, recruitment, assessment, interpretation, and also communication of those results. And studies ranged from high quality to very low quality, or low confidence to high confidence in the results. So in our qualitative analysis, so that is systematic review for primary outcomes, and that was depression and anxiety, in 9 studies with a little bit over 140,000 participants favored meat eaters. So that means that these 9 studies found individuals who consumed meat, they had lower levels of anxiety and depression. And 2 studies with close to 800 participants favored vegans and vegetarians. That means that vegans and vegetarians had lower levels of anxiety and depression. So an important point here I want to mention is that majority of the studies, these 9 studies that favored meat eaters, were high and moderate quality studies, and 2 studies that favored vegans and vegetarians were low quality studies. So our results for the secondary outcomes, and that included self-harm, mood, stress perception, quality of life, affective well-being, were less clear. So we have 4 studies with a little bit over 36,000 participants favored meat eaters, and 3 studies close to 800 participants favored vegans and vegetarians. And again, all these 4 studies favoring meat eaters were moderate quality studies, and 3 studies that favored vegans and vegetarians were low quality studies. So we performed a meta-analysis, so quantitative analysis, on only 2 primary outcomes, and that was depression and anxiety, which are, again, 2 most prevalent mental health disorders. And this analysis confirmed our qualitative findings from the systematic review. So for every study included in our reviews, we calculated a strength of the relation between diet, diet, anxiety, and depression. And this strength is known as the effect size. So here we see a forest plot on the right-hand side that depicts this relation between diet and, in this case, depression. So studies here are arranged from high quality on the top to low quality on the bottom. And on the right-hand side, as I mentioned before, we see forest plot with squares. So each study has its associated square. And these squares represent effect sizes or a strength of the relation between diet and depression. And each square also has its associated 95% of confidence intervals. And this is this line going through each square. So we can see that the higher the quality study, which is here on the top, the stronger and more consistent inverse relation between meat consumption and depression. And we can also see a clear tight pattern in the high and moderate studies, whereas studies with a low quality, the squares are less consistent. So when taking into account all studies, the overall effect or relation is noted here with this diamond in this circle. And the higher and the more positive the number, the more positive the finding favoring meat eaters. In other words, meat eaters have lower levels of depression than vegetarians. And the same pattern was observed for anxiety. The stronger and more consistent the relation between meat consumption and anxiety. And again, the studies were arranged from high to low. Here we see a little bit less studies because the papers that we included in our reviews, not all of them had anxiety as an outcome. So as mentioned before, an important part of both of our reviews was study quality or the study rigor. So to assess the impact study quality had on the relation between diet and depression and anxiety, we performed a meta-regression. And what you see here is known as a bubble plot. And it's showing a relation between a quality score, which we can see on this x-axis from 0 to 100, and if that effect size or strength of the relation on the y-axis. And the circles represent each study. So what we see here is a positive relation depicted with this regression line in bold between quality score and effect size. So the greater the study quality, the more positive the inverse relation between eating meat and depression. And you also notice that circles are different sizes. So the size of the circle then represents basically the within study variance. So in other words, the larger the sample of the study, the smaller the circle, and vice versa. And the same pattern, again, is observed for the anxiety. So we also did what they call cumulative analysis to examine the impact of study quality on the relation between diet and mental health. And this analysis supported the findings from the meta-regression analysis. So as before, studies are ranged from high quality to low quality. And we tested the impact of every single study on the overall relation, where studies are sequentially one by one added into the model. So here we see that the high and moderate study quality showed greater differences, whereas low to very low study quality showed smaller differences between meat eaters and vegetarians. And the same pattern was observed for the anxiety. So in sum, there is a clear evidence that being vegetarian is associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm. The results with respect to the secondary outcomes, such as mood, well-being, stress, quality of life, were less clear. And our quantitative, so meta-analysis, also showed that vegans experienced higher levels of depression than meat eaters. However, there were no differences between males and females on any of these relations. And then finally, we showed that the higher the study quality, the more positive the benefits of eating meat. So in terms of the strengths and the limitations of the reviewed literature, we found that the most rigorous studies used objective assessments for mental health, or they used multiple measures, including reported physician diagnosed conditions, prescription medication, and self-reported symptoms and behaviors. The most rigorous studies also had large, representative, and matched samples, whereas the least rigorous studies used biased recruitment strategies and biased convenience sampling. And one major limitation of all studies was the use of self-reported questionnaires, which is not a valid way to measure any variable because of the potential for misreporting, social desirability, reactivity, and of course, false memories. Many studies also did not include important potential variables, such as, for example, race, ethnicity, religion, as well as lifestyle behaviors, such as smoking and alcohol use, which can directly affect health and also physiologic determinants of dietary energy intake. And then finally, most studies were correlational or observational in nature. Therefore, we cannot make any temporal or causal inferences. So our reviews had some strengths. First is our decision to select only studies that provide a very clear distinction between meat eaters and meat abstainers. And that was necessary because self-reported assessments such as food frequency questionnaires should not be used for quantitative analysis because of their invalidity. Our psychological outcomes were limited to only well-defined and the most prevalent disorders, so depression and anxiety, which allowed for focused yet rigorous analysis. And finally, we had over 170,000 participants, so large sample size, and that can provide more generalizable and definitive conclusions. And there are, of course, some limitations, such as exclusion of the non-English language studies. And we also excluded many studies on this topic because of our strengths, because we included only well-defined constructs, as well as we had that clear distinction between meat eaters and meat abstainers. So based on our findings, we have few recommendations. One is that researchers should use more objective assessments and physician-diagnosed disorders over self-reported symptoms. And also the use of probability sampling compared to convenience sampling is preferable because individuals highly invested in specific dietary patterns have strong ideologic investment and may be predisposed to intentional or non-intentional misreporting. Detailed health-related histories and current lifestyles, as well as complete statistical information, should be reported to allow researchers for exploring potentially important and also unanswered questions. And finally, instead of using correlational and observational studies, researchers should use more rigorous study designs, such as RCTs, randomized control trials. So to sum up, our findings do not support veganism and vegetarianism as a strategy to benefit psychological health. So I would like to thank my colleagues and students for their collaboration. So for those of you who know me, are aware that I love to involve a number of students in my lab every semester to improve their research and writing skills. And as per our USI mission, try to prepare them to make positive contributions to communities and to be lifetime learners in a diverse and global society. I would also like to thank my sponsors that supported many of my projects. I received many university and college-wide as well as external grants, specifically for this project from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Beef Checkoff. And for more information, please visit our papers. They are freely available online from the critical reviews in food science and nutrition. And I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dobersek. At the moment, we only have, I'm frozen. Everything's frozen on my screen. I hope I'm not frozen. We have one question. It says, I would be curious to know what some of the most common statistical controls were in these models, if you were able to speak to that. Oh, I guess I'm not frozen.
Sure. I believe that was a trend. I'm not exactly sure what specifically a trend you're referring to. The most common statistical controls. So I'm assuming that you're referring to our studies, what we controlled for. Is that correct, Trent?
Yes. So, well, not so much the studies that you included in your analysis. So you after I asked the question, you identified a few, such as alcohol consumption, smoking, some of the other things that might be indicators of depression or anxiety that you would want to control for in a model.
Right. So for the purpose of our studies, we could not do that because the studies were not very consistent. Some of them included, some of them did not include, and also the type of information or how they assessed those variables was very difficult to provide any meaningful analysis. So hopefully in the future, researchers can or should, that's one of our recommendations, include many of those variables to be able to use them in the statistical models and control for that. Yeah, I do agree with that trend. Thank you for your question.
All right. Looks like Julie has a question.
Hey, Urska, can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, okay, sorry. Okay, so at the end you talked about how, oh God, how do I lower my hand? Okay, you talked about how this might be different in different sorts of cultures because you don't have a representative sample. And so I don't know if you could speculate about how this might be different in populations or with different sorts of samples where veganism or vegetarianism are the sort of predominant decision in those cultures, right? Whether for religious reasons or other sorts of reasons. And so I don't know if you could, and that's way outside of this research, but I don't know if you could speak to that at all.
Sure, I can say a few words about that. I mean, overall, we had pretty high sample size from this 1820 studies, over 170,000 participants. However, we did not include, because the primary studies did not include any of the reasons why individuals are adopting vegan and vegetarian diet or why they're omitting meat. So it's a great question, and it would be interesting to see how that plays out in, like you said, different cultures. And there is also the question on, how individuals characterize, what is meat, and white meat versus red meat versus other, I guess, types of meats. And again, there was no information, unfortunately, within those studies. And that's kind of goes back to self-report that I discussed to a great extent. How do we go about assessing that? So hopefully in the future, that would be more clear in terms of the relation between diet and mental health. So Good question, Julie, and hopefully, like I said, future research will do more explorations on that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Urska.
Thank you.
And supplements I needed. Takes quite a bit of education, resources, money, etc. to be a healthy vegan. Other than reducing the risk of heart disease and obesity, global warming is one of the biggest factors vegans are taking into account when making dietary choices. Do you have any information on the environmental impact the meat industry has?
Thank you, Haley, for the question. I'm not sure in what direction this is, or into what direction the question is phrased. But in terms of the, I think the future will be to basically artificially creating meat products. I feel like that will minimize stress and anxiety of many individuals who do not like to see animals suffer. So I think that's a great addition for those individuals. And I would think that also that would impact the environment in the future.
All right, we have another question that came in. What other projects are you currently working on related to this?
Thank you, Shri, for the question. So one project that we are currently thinking about related to this topic is to examine other types of disorders. So currently, as I discussed, we focus primarily on the most prevalent disorders. So it would be interesting to see what that relation looks like in other disorders, such as perhaps eating disorders. And another idea that we are considering is to look at the relation between eating meat, or between meat and masculinity. So going into a little bit different direction, not necessarily looking at mental health.
All right, we have another question that says, or Shri said, thank you. Julie says, could you discuss what the toughest part of conducting a meta-analysis was for you and your collaborators? Any tips or advice for other researchers?
Thank you, Julie, for this great question. So the toughest part would be, first of all, being familiar with how to go about doing this type of research, which unfortunately, perhaps many researchers, and also I would say more specifically students, do not have that experience in their undergraduate studies. So knowing what our own biases are can greatly diminish or can increase the value of the research and the reliability of what we're doing. So, and also determining what is, as I discussed, inclusion and exclusion criteria. So being very clear to which studies we are going to be including and which studies are going to be excluded. So that's very, very important to do that at the beginning of anything dealing with the research, prior looking and systematically finding the papers. So inclusion, exclusion criteria, that's a very important part of that. And then also for the individuals, in terms of the meta-analysis, there are a lot of different things to think about and to pay attention to. So that's more from the statistical perspective. Thank you, Julie, for the question.
All right, here's another one. Do you think the reasons people are choosing veganism could be an added stressor that contributes to depression and anxiety? for example, worry about their health, the environment, antibiotic resistance, etc. So the attitude one has about their diet may play a role as important as the diet itself. Interesting.
Thank you, Haley, for another question. Yes, definitely. The direction in terms of the which causes which, or what comes first, is it the egg or the chicken? I believe that's one of your, that's where you're going with this question. It's, at this point, we were unable to answer this question. Is it our worry or our anxieties sort of causing us to consume certain types of diets, or vice versa? Is it our diet that is causing our anxiety or different types of disorders? So hopefully in the future, researchers can do more rigorous designs for us to be able to answer this question. But yes, in short, Haley, it is possible.
Dr. Dobersek, thank you so much for this interesting and informative presentation. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us, who has questions, who just witnessed it. So thank you all for attending. Before we conclude, I'd like to make a couple announcements about the faculty colloquium for the rest of the semester. We have 3 more scheduled for the 2022 series. On February 25th, we have Robert Dickey's. His presentation is titled Americana Revisited, A Portrait of Contemporary Society. On March 25th, we have Dr. Rocco G. Gennaro. His presentation is titled The Brain Damage Argument and the Prospect of an Afterlife. And then on April 22nd, we have Jason Callahan. His presentation is titled Law and Disorder, Assessing Conflicting News Coverage of Police Use of Force. These are all going to be on Zoom. They're all Fridays at 3 p.m. They're free, open to the public. Please encourage your colleagues, students, friends, whoever to join these presentations. We hope to have you all join us during each of these presentations. And with that, we are done with today's session. Thank you again for attending. We look forward to seeing you at the next faculty colloquium again on February 25th. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much, Quentin.